I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 17908 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. This episode is brought to you by Legacy Staffs, which are crafted by the Brazos Walking Stick Company out in beautiful Waco, Texas. You can go to brazosticks.com and use my name, one word, Mac Payne, at the checkout and get a whopping 10% off your next order of the Legacy Staff or cane of your own design. I have one of those Legacy Staffs, and it is one of my most prized possessions. It is an amazing thing. It's true what they say in the Bible. Even though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you will be comforted by a rod and a staff. I have a staff, and I'll guarantee you I'm comforted. It's a substantial work of art. You are highly recommended to get one of those staffs yourself. Go to brazosticks.com, use my name, Mac Payne, one word, at the checkout, get that 10%, and before you know it, you'll have your own special Legacy staff. I come to you in this episode today with a heavy heart, primarily because there are people in this country who are intent upon tearing it apart. I don't know if they're crazy, bought off by our enemies, or what, but it's disturbing, especially as a person who fought for this country. I don't like to see people try and tear it down. You know how one thing leads to another? I'm going to share a story with you in this episode that leads me to some unnerving and sad conclusions. The story I'm going to share with you comes out of Lewiston, Idaho. It's about what they've done out there with one of the runways at the Lewiston Nez Perce County Regional Airport. They've just repaved one of those, and they had a big ribbon-cutting ceremony, and they allowed a Vietnam veteran pilot to make the first takeoff and landing on that runway. It's a great story. I'm going to share it with you. It brought up something. Out there in Lewiston, Idaho, as in most places in this country, before the Anglo-Saxons and others arrived, there were native people living there. The white man came in and rooted out space in that area for themselves. I get the impression many of the Native Americans did not appreciate that. Unfortunately, that leads me to a very disturbing development. You're probably aware that the owner of the Washington Redskins National Football League team is changing the name of that team. Regardless of the tradition, regardless of the opinion of many of the fans who like the Washington Redskins, especially back when George Allen was the coach and Billy Kilmer and Sonny Jurgensen were the quarterbacks. The owner says he is changing the name because it's offensive to certain people. That's debatable. I don't know if he really wanted to do it, but there's a movement out there that forced him to do it. It's important to note that when these movements get started, they never stop. They keep it up. They will not be satisfied with the mere change of a football team name. I believe they're going to keep pushing it until they force all the white people out of states like Idaho and give all the land back to the Native Americans. There are arguments both ways on this question, but I sincerely believe that the people who came in there made things better out there in Idaho and other states, not just for the white people, but for everybody who lives there. they have a better life. Take, for instance, this runway I'm going to tell you about in this story. I have a message for all Vietnam veterans. We appreciate our country and our way of life and our Constitution. We fought for it in a foreign land. I think we should all stand up and at least make it clear to all these people who want to make changes to this wonderful country. Let them know that they're going down the wrong path and it's not the right thing to do. I'm not advocating violence. I'm advocating sit down and start writing. I think that's how you do it. I believe that'll be more effective than violence. Let people know the truth. You do that by writing and speaking. We still have the First Amendment. Let's use it. That's the lead into the story. I'm going to tell you about a Vietnam veteran by the name of Johnny Stewart, who flies his own Cessna 170B out of the Lewiston Nez Perce County Regional Airport on a regular basis. He was honored by being allowed to make the first takeoff and landing at this newly renovated runway out there at that airport. By the way, one of the things Johnny Stewart does with his Cessna 170B is to fly people to doctor's appointments. Typical of a Vietnam veteran. Johnny Stewart is an excellent representative of that Vietnam veteran generation, one as great as any that ever heeded the call of duty from its country. Johnny Stewart proves that every day he takes off with a sick person in his airplane headed to a hospital somewhere. By the way, if you're not familiar with the location of Lewiston, Idaho, it sits right on the western border of Idaho, about 100 miles south-southeast of Spokane, Washington, right on the banks of the beautiful Snake River. Let's take a look at this story and find out how another Vietnam veteran was honored. The story appeared in the Lewiston Tribune. It was titled, Airport Christians' Newly Completed Runway. The story was provided by Elaine Williams, a writer for the Tribune. This is what Elaine had to say in her story. Dateline, Lewiston, Idaho. A cluster of men and women stood on a taxiway at the Lewiston Nez Perce County Regional Airport Friday, listening while Johnny Stewart received instructions from an air traffic controller. I'm assuming they had a speaker out there so they could hear it. Within minutes, Stewart took off in his Cessna 170B single-engine tail dragger, piloting the first flight from the Lewiston Airport's rebuilt secondary runway. It was nice and smooth, as it should be after all that work, he said of the runway surface when he landed. The group on the taxiway included airport officials, along with employees from contractor Knife River and project designer TO Engineering. They were gathered for a brief event that included a ribbon cutting, but was closed to the public because of the COVID-1984 pandemic. Vietnam veteran Johnny Stewart, who is a young 81 of Lewiston, was selected to initiate the runway because of the many ways he has served his country and the community. That's right. When the Vietnam veterans came home from that war, they were older, wiser, stronger, and better able to deal with adversities than their non-Vietnam veteran contemporaries. Johnny Stewart has helped prove that over the last 50 years. He's a retired U.S. Army captain and pilot who served in the Vietnam War. He volunteers for a group that flies patients to medical treatment free of charge. Let me read that to you again. Johnny Stewart is a retired U.S. Army captain and a pilot who served in the Vietnam War. He volunteers for a group that flies patients to medical treatments free of charge. As a fellow Vietnam veteran to Johnny Stewart, I'm not really surprised that he would do such a wonderful thing like that. Continuing, Stewart is also among the private pilots who store their planes at the Lewiston Airport who will benefit from the $7 million U.S. upgrade. The 34-year-old runway had large cracks and holes that earned it a rating of poor, one category above failure, which requires closure before the project began. Sounds like some of the ratings I got from my college professors up there at the University of Florida. Continuing. Its replacement, referring to the refurbished runway, has a new base and lights instead of reflectors to illuminate it at night. It is 4,750 feet long, 250 feet shorter than the old runway, to eliminate an overlap of its safety zone with the safety zone of the primary runway. It meets all new Federal Aviation Administration safety standards, said Gary Peters, Airport Authority Board Chairman. It was narrowed from 100 feet wide to 75 feet because that's the most the FAA, which paid for 94% of the project, will allow for a secondary runway. I don't think that'll be a problem for pilots like Johnny Stewart. The work started in late March when many businesses and schools were closing around the country to slow the spread of the coronavirus. Still, the project was only delayed 2 weeks for wet weather, not because of the pandemic. Remember, this is Idaho. They're not a bunch of wussies out there who run and hide at the first alert by some out-of-towners. The Knife River Construction Company managed to get all of the supplies and equipment it needed, Peters said. While the runway was out of service, the aircraft that normally used the secondary runway were diverted to the airport's longer and wider primary runway. The secondary runway represents a majority of the traffic at the airport. Among them are cargo carriers for UPS and FedEx, private carriers, and crop dusters. Speaking as an outsider, I have a question. If the majority of the traffic at that airport uses the secondary runway, why don't they just use it all the time and let the other traffic that goes there use the secondary runway? Pardon me, I am not in contact with the airport management. Continuing. SkyWest, the only commercial passenger airline serving Lewiston, lands on the primary runway. Sounds like that might be the only aircraft that land on the primary runway. Everybody else uses the secondary. Continuing. Even though commercial passenger planes don't use the secondary runway, rebuilding it helps Lewiston make the case to add flights on the only existing route between Lewiston and Salt Lake City, or 2 new destinations, Peters said. The availability of the secondary runway means commercial passenger flights won't be interrupted if there is an accident with general aviation aircraft. I was just thinking, hopefully that does not occur frequently at the airport. Accidents? Continuing. Plus, the FAA is more likely to pay for an air traffic control tower if the airport has 2 runways, and that creates a safer environment for commercial passenger planes, Peter said. This is a big win, he added. And now, in addition to knowing that a Vietnam veteran out in Lewiston, Idaho, was honored by being able to make the first takeoff and landing at the newly refurbished secondary runway at the Lewiston, Nez Perce County Regional Airport, you also know more about what's going on at that airport and how it should be an improvement for everybody in the area who utilize air travel or air services. Just think of all those farmers out there that use the crop dusters. They should get a lot more efficient and quicker service now. And think about all those patients that Johnny Stewart flies to their appointments at no cost. He's going to be able to do it quicker and better in the future. Johnny Stewart, on behalf of a grateful nation and all your fellow Vietnam veterans, I hereby issue you an official Vietnam Veteran News Podcast salute for your service to your country, both in Vietnam and back home in Lewiston, Idaho. Thank you very much. We wish you the best. This is Mike Payne closing out episode 179 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
If you like what How about that? Ain't that a mess?